my having just talked about the bishop having given me a drink after I'd done something I felt very uneasy about. The bishop, uh, the bishop's wife died about 4 years before he did. She'd had a stroke, and they'd had round the clock care there in the home for a few years before she died. And strangely enough, the bishop told me one day he thought those were the happiest days of her life, which I thought was rather surprising. But she'd been a person that was always sort of tense and concerned about things. And after the stroke, she didn't have a worry in the world. And she was still able to sit up at the table and chew her food and swallow it and listen to what people said. She couldn't talk very much. But at any rate, the bishop, I want to talk about drinking. The bishop loved to drink. And when he'd come to our house and sometimes stay all night, he always had a lot more to drink than I was ever used to seeing my dad have. Uh, he seemed to handle it well, but I think he may have averaged 3 or maybe 4 stiff drinks of whiskey a day. That would be a wild guess, but when in his later years, after he'd retired, I would go visit him every once in a while, and I discovered that he had a group that gathered there every day at the cocktail hour, and that's when I finally realized the finest hour of the for Episcopalians is the cocktail hour. I really believe that because they get together and it's such pleasant conversations. And I used to wonder why it was that the bishop lived to be 92 or 3 and my father only lived to be 75. They had so many things in common. And my dad didn't drink near as much as the bishop did, but he stressed and he would become angry and upset sometimes for days. And I was kind of watching the bishop and thinking, how did he work this out that he's living so long and so healthy? And what I realized was, in listening there, when the little cocktail hour would start, the bishop would start describing the frustrations he'd had that day. That was early in the days of when you called customer services. You ended up with somebody in India on the phone who had a very heavy accent, and he would tell about experiences he had like that, and there were other things that frustrated him. But he would describe his frustrations, and others would kibitz or maybe take the floor and tell about some of their frustrations, and they'd have a couple of drinks. And after a while, the bishop would find something about it that was funny, and it was usually the joke was on him about the way he'd reacted to some frustrating situation or something he'd said that was sort of silly. And pretty soon he'd be laughing, and then everybody would be laughing. And the stress would go out of their faces, and they would relax. And I thought, oh, that's how the bishop is pulling this off. He's letting it go at the end of the day. And it occurred to me much later, probably didn't even need the alcohol to do that. It was a useful lubricant, but the main thing was the little conversation, the reflection, the turning it back on yourself, uh, having a little laugh at your own foibles. That's how he did it. But when the bishop's wife died, all of a sudden, his daughter, his oldest child, came from the East Coast and leagued up with his youngest child, who happened to be a daughter too. He had 2 sons and 2 daughters. The 2 daughters came and they engaged a realtor. The elder daughter had been promised some antique furniture out of the estate, and even though he was still there, she got a moving truck and got the antique furniture she wanted and went back to her home on the East Coast with the anticipation that the realtor was going to sell the house. And the story was that the bishop was going to go live with the younger of his 2 sons, who was a retired doctor, medical doctor, and his wife in Northwest Portland. And I knew that that would just absolutely devastate the bishop. He was always used to entertaining, and he was the master of the house, and had a deep, booming voice. And to go and live in a spare bedroom at his son's house uh, was not going to work well for him. I'd studied in social work graduate school that you don't move elderly people around, it's devastating for them, and so on. So I was I was just appalled at this real estate sign in the front yard, and so I ended up opposing the sale of the house. And it's kind of a long story how it all worked out, but his elder son's wife and her daughter teamed up with me, and we dug our heels in and said, "This isn't right. He is not so infirm he can't live in his own house," which he wasn't. He was still completely ambulatory. He was still going to the grocery store and buying his groceries and so on. So he had 4 more years there, uh, living in that house before he finally uh, wound down and died there in his own house. So that was a big achievement of mine, uh, sticking up for somebody who had been sort of a surrogate father for me after mine died. Uh, but that was the end of my story about the bishop.